As she was going down the hill, she was a bit tentative because of this big trailer she was pulling. Well, the trailer began to rock violently, and it was bumping into the car. And she completely lost, she couldn't steer the car anymore. She lost control. And so she's going down. It looks like a disaster about to happen. People are pulling off in both directions, trying to get out of the way of this obvious accident about to happen. And so she did what any of us would naturally do. She started to step on the brake. And her friend who was driving with her yelled out, Ann, don't step on the brake, step on the gas. Well, it went against every instinct that she had. She wanted to slow that car down and get that trailer under control. But she overrode that impulse and stepped on the gas. And just within a few seconds, the trailer settled down. What had happened, obviously, is she was going downhill. The gravity took control of the trailer, and the trailer was pushing the car. And so I tell leaders all the time, your job is to lead. You've got to be out in front. And most leaders know that. And so, in fact, what they have to do is step on the gas.
This is the Brandon Smith Show, and of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and the entire purpose of this show is one singular thing, and that is to help you live a life that much more free from dysfunction. So today's topic, I think, is a great topic because it applies not only to the workplace, but it applies to our families, all the people around us. How do we bring out the very best in others? How do we bring out the very best in others? And so to help us guide us on this journey, I can't think of someone better than Dr. Tim Irwin. So Tim, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we are thrilled because not only do I get a chance to look at your fourth book now around this and hearing more about this journey you've been on in life, but to learn from you on what you've discovered to help us do this. So just so I make sure that everyone gets a sense of who you are. So looking at your bio, I mean, there's so many impressive things here. You have a PhD in organizational psychology. And I know you've consulted with a number of kind of well-known companies, both sounds like domestically and globally.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And you're a frequent speaker at corporate events, and you've, and again, four books, including several on the New York Times bestseller.
I'm tired just hearing you say it.
So before we jump into this topic of how do we bring out the very best in others, whether we're talking about workplace or our family, tell us a little bit more about you. What got you on this journey in the first place?
I have been on a quest for years. After graduate school, I worked before I went to graduate school, and then went back and I had several jobs afterwards, started several firms. Our firm was bought by a large Philadelphia company. We merged with a Fortune 500 company. So I went from a tiny entrepreneur to working for a very large Fortune 500 company.
Wow.
And so I learned so much through that experience, but across that whole time, there's been a singular quest, and that is, how do we bring out the best in people? Yeah. I see a lot of organizational environments that do just the opposite. They really discourage people. They bring out the worst in certain respects. And so fortunately, I think we're starting to discover some things that really work, some things that are important.
Yeah, so maybe a good starting place is, what are some of the things you see us doing today that is not helping to create that environment where we're almost limiting people rather than bringing out the best? And then we can talk about how do we actually do it the right way.
That's a great question. One of the things that I observe, and I've consulted with over 400 companies, interviewed over 10,000 leaders over the course of my career, and I believe our corporate environment, in many cases, certainly not all, there's some exemplary examples of companies that don't do this, but they're filled with what I call words of death. And it's subtle. For example, I've used this phrase before, perhaps you have, where we talk about holding someone's feet to the fire. Now, do you know where that came from? Do you know where that phrase came from?
No.
In the Middle Ages, they would torture heretics to get them to recant, and so they would literally strap them down and put their feet very close to a fire until they were tortured enough. Or we talk about build a fire under that person. You talk about somebody that's not very motivated, you build a fire under them. Well, that came from the 1800s in England, where the chimneys were very tall and steep and narrow. And the boss would tell the chimney sweep, hey, if you don't get all the way up there to the top, I'm going to build a fire under you. And so we use those phrases. This literally happened to me about 2 years ago. A CEO was going to fire a fairly prominent person in the organization. He said, "There's nothing so clarifying as a good public hanging."
Wow.
That these phrases are subtle.
That's quite a picture.
Well, it is quite a picture. And I'm saying that our corporate environments are often filled with words of death. And those tend to engage a part of the brain which actually limits access to the parts of the brain that we most want in the workplace, like creativity and innovation, problem solving.
Yeah, and I would imagine if I was hearing those kinds of phrases from my leader, it's definitely not going to foster an environment of psychological safety. I'm not going to want to put my neck out on the line. There, I just used another one.
That's totally right. And our brains are constantly scanning the environment, asking a very simple question: am I safe? Now, it's not so much in today's times physical safety, although that's not completely irrelevant, but it's more about emotional, psychological safety.
Yeah.
Am I safe here? And too often in the corporate world, or even in our families, for example, I know families that have, where there's a harsh climate culture in that family, but too often that the answer to the question, am I safe, is no. And what happens is the amygdala, part of the brain, engages, and it has a negativity bias. It's sort of looking for unsafe environments. And when that part of the brain is engaged, those other good parts are cut off.
Yeah, so then we turtle, right? We go into our shells and we become more defensive.
I ask corporate leaders very often, what's the most hated event in the corporate world?
Oh, interesting. Most hated event in the corporate world.
It's hated by the givers and the receivers.
Performance reviews.
Exactly. It is.
I win the prize, folks.
You do.
I don't know what the prize is. Hopefully it's not a performance review. That would not be the kind of prize
It's
I'd
the
want
most
to win.
hated event in the corporate world. And the people that give the corporate or the performance reviews hate them, and the recipients hate them even more, because it gives the wrong answer to the question, am I safe?
Yeah.
Because no, I don't feel safe.
Yeah. It makes me just uncomfortable. All right. So it sounds like, from hearing you talk, the first thing is we need to be careful about the language and words we're using, that word choice. Even phrases that we think are just commonplace could be actually words of death, as you said. And then noticing what are other things we're putting in place that may be creating an unsafe environment, or an environment where we feel more on the defensive. Because as you said, our brain is looking for that kind of stuff.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so now if we pivot to the happy stuff, the stuff we should be doing, what are some examples of that? I think you call those words of life. Is that right?
Well, that's exactly right. And what we've now learned from brain science, we didn't have the mechanisms or the technology to really fully observe this until about 7 years ago. And what we now know is that affirmation of another person tends to be what brings out the best. Now, this seems very simple, very commonplace, but we now have this brain science, and there are many, many studies that show that affirmation reduces stress, it increases our productivity. It even does things like boost our immune system. So there's some tremendous positive benefits to affirmation. And what I talk about in my new book is that words of life are those words that affirm. Words of life go into that part of the brain that brings out the best in us.
Yeah, really interesting. So let's talk about it first in the workplace, and then I'd love to kind of pivot a little bit and even talk about how we might apply it outside the workplace,
Yeah, absolutely.
whether it's significant others or children or those kind of environments too. So if we're talking to leaders and they're saying, well, okay, Tim, I get this. How do I do that? Or what should that look like?
Well, here's the problem that leaders face. I tell the story about my wife, her first job out of college was in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And so she's working there and living there. Well, she gets a promotion, and her organization asked her to move to Pullman, Washington, which is west of Wisconsin. So she and a friend were driving and
that's very west.
That's very west, exactly. About almost as far
multiple
west.
States west.
There you go. So they were driving. She had packed all her worldly possessions in a U-Haul trailer, and they were driving. So they went up to the top of the Continental Divide. And so as you're traveling west, the further you go, when you reach the top, then you're going downhill. So it was Ann's turn to drive, and as she was going down the hill, she was a bit tentative because of this big trailer she was pulling. Well, the trailer began to rock violently, and it was bumping into the car. And she completely lost, she couldn't steer the car anymore. She lost control. And so she's going down. It looks like a disaster about to happen. People are pulling off in both directions, trying to get out of the way of this obvious accident about to happen. And so she did what any of us would naturally do. She started to step on the brake. And her friend who was driving with her yelled out, Ann, don't step on the brake, step on the gas. Well, it went against every instinct that she had. She wanted to slow that car down and get that trailer under control. But she overrode that impulse and stepped on the gas. And just within a few seconds, the trailer settled down. What had happened, obviously, is she was going downhill. The gravity took control of the trailer, and the trailer was pushing the car. And so I tell leaders all the time, your job is to lead. You've got to be out in front. And most leaders know that. And so, in fact, what they have to do is step on the gas. They have to motivate people. They have to foster a climate of productivity. So the question is, how do you do that? How do you, in fact, step on the gas and bring out the best in people?
Yeah.
And affirmation is the key. Breathing words of life into the organization, into specific individuals.
Okay. It's funny. I don't think I have seen from my own experience over about the last 10 years since we had that recession in 2008 and all the impact that it's had on the workplace. I've seen this kind of fall off a cliff. Like we just don't do it like we used to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because we're bad people. It just seems like time's everyone's most precious resource and everything's urgent all the time. And so we're not doing that. So how do you get people back in the habit of doing this?
Well, I'm a pragmatist. I mean, I tell corporate leaders all the time, I'm suggesting you do this because we now have this based on science. We're all under tremendous stress. And stress tends to bring out the worst in us as leaders. In other words, we resort to expediency, we resort to methods, we resort to, I ask people all the time, why do parents yell at their kids? Well, it works. I mean, you get a response from your kids. It's not a good thing to do. It doesn't bring out the best in your children, but expedience works in some cases. And I find that corporate leaders sometimes push people. They don't take the time to give them feedback, to coach them, to encourage them. And so as a result, we get results, we get short-term results, but it doesn't develop people. It doesn't bring out their best capabilities. Brandon, I ask corporate leaders very often when I speak, I say, how many of you believe that people in your organization, not all, but many, are capable of contributing to the organization at a higher level? You know what percent response I get? About 100. And I've probably asked 10,000 leaders this question. They say, yeah, I think that many of the people in my company are capable of contributing at a higher level.
Wow. That's good.
It is good.
That's a good answer.
Well, it's a good answer, but the second question is harder. Well, I say, if they're capable of contributing at a higher level, why aren't they? And that's when people get really quiet and they start looking at their shoes. And the third question is, what do you do about it?
Yeah.
How do you, in fact, Mike Ducker at FedEx, who he led as CEO many of their different subsidiaries, he calls it that discretionary effort. So you have this FedEx delivery person, and he or she's looking, if I walk 20 more steps, I'm going to get this package either in a safer place or I'm going to get it undercover. And, what makes a difference between just kind of putting it at the closest place to me or just taking those extra 20 steps and putting it in a better place? That's that 20% discretionary effort. And corporate leaders, I think, would be well advised to use the best technology, the best methods, the best principles of leadership to, in fact, bring out that discretionary effort. And very often, that's what makes a difference financially in margin. In other words, if you're talking about EBITDA, it's that discretionary effort that really produces that margin that corporate leaders are so after.
Yeah. Okay. So we're getting close to break. As we roll into break, part of what I want to, when we come back from break, well, I'm going to stay on this topic of corporate leaders for a little while and talk a little bit about how do they do this when they constantly, in the back of their minds, my experience has been they're constantly telling themselves, we're not going fast enough, we're not doing enough quickly enough, we need to be doing more, better, faster. And so it's like they achieve something, and rather than stopping and celebrating it, they've already moved on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when we come back, I would love to get your thoughts, maybe even a prescription perhaps, on how we could balance that tension while still bringing in more affirmation.
I'll tell you 3 ways to affirm. How's that?
Okay, that's a great segue into a break. This is not your first rodeo. Stay tuned. Tim's going to be back with 3 ways we're going to do that. We'll be right back. Here's your coaching minute for the week, presented to you by the Leadership Foundry. So building credibility is essential to us as leaders, both in terms of working with our team, but also in terms of building credibility with others. One of the easy ways to do that is to focus on being more responsive. How responsive are you to emails, whether it's from your team or other leaders? That is as a good friend of mine and regular guest on my podcast, John Kim, says, responsiveness is cheap currency. And what John means by that is it's really easy to do, but it goes a long way. I had a leader I worked with several years ago, and he would typically respond to emails 4 to 6 weeks after they were sent, and he had no credibility with his team. So here's a challenge for you. Work on your responsiveness. Can you respond to emails within 24 to 48 hours? Now, what that doesn't mean is you have to respond with an answer. It can just simply mean, hey, I got it. I'll get back to you by whatever date. But by focusing on responsiveness, that can enhance your credibility. So give it a try. Welcome back from break. Of course, this is the Brandon Smith Show, and today we have the wonderful pleasure of having Dr. Tim Irwin with us. And Tim, we were talking before the break about what leaders can do when they've got all this pressure for more, better, faster, and it seems like when they're pushing the organization and pushing others towards that end, they're not stopping to say, hey, by the way, that thing you did last quarter, way to go. They've just kind of gone right on to, it's almost a what have you done for me lately kind of orientation. So what, as leaders, what can we be doing to, while we have that tension, balance it with affirmation?
Let me give you 3 ideas.
Okay.
First, a principle. There's a few things that are really clearly established in behavioral science, but this is one of them. The closer the affirmation to the occurrence of the event you want to encourage, the more effective it is. In other words, that's what's wrong with performance review. You know, in December, you could have solved world peace in January, but in December, that's a distant memory. Nobody even thinks about it. And so one of the things I encourage people to do is affirm quickly. In other words, affirm on the spot. So here are 3 things you can do. I talk about how we all have 3 faces. We have an outward-facing style. We have a deeper part of us, our conduct or behavior, and then the deepest is our core. And each of those areas you have to speak to in slightly different ways. And I cover this in my book in more detail, but let's talk about this.
Yeah.
So the outward-facing style, Carl Jung said that we all have a persona. In other words, it's this term of this outward, it's the way we kind of present ourselves to the world. It's an outward-facing style. And style really matters. How we act, how we are in meetings or how we're dealing with other people, it really has a huge impact. You see this a lot in life, but you see it in the movies. So affirming someone's style says to a person, I'll use you as my example, hey, Brandon, the way you handle a meeting, the way you spoke to people was really effective. In other words, your manner, it was an emotional topic, it was a high energy topic, but you kind of toned it down a little bit. You reined it in and you spoke more reasonably to people. And so as a result, they listened. It took some of the sting out of the topic.
Nice.
And so your manner in dealing with that was really good. So that's how you might affirm style. Conduct maybe goes a little deeper, and it says, Brandon, we had talked about this before, but you, in this new project you're putting together, you went and talked to a number of other functional heads. In other words, you went to marketing, you went to sales, you went to operations, and you socialized your idea. You told them what you were thinking about and wanted their input and how to involve them in this. And they responded tremendously. I mean, the way you did this caused them to want to help you. They said, hey, count me in. I'm with you. Tell me what we need to do. And so that decision to involve those other functional leaders very early in the process. And we've seen people who get the cake too baked, and then people don't want to eat the cake. So this way, you got them involved at the mixing stage. And as a result, they responded very positively.
Nice.
So that's our conduct. In other words, the outward-facing style, our manner, how we handle things, but the conduct is our actions, what we did. But then think about our core. And by the way, I would ask you and our listeners, our viewers, do you talk to yourself?
I do, out loud usually.
Well, that's right. But the question I ask is, who are you talking to? I was in the gym the other day, and I was feeling so lazy, and I said to myself, come on, get going. Well, the reality is there's a person inside us. It's what I call our core. People ask where it is. Well, I don't know. It's kind of inside us. It's our mind. It's our heart. There are more neural cells in our heart than are in our brains. So, it's our core. It's our being. It's the person that speaks to us. If you listen carefully, you can actually hear yourself talk. Scientists say we speak twice as many words to ourselves as we do to others. So that person is our core. That's where our beliefs are housed. That's where we contemplate our actions. And so when you affirm somebody's core, you're going pretty deep. The language of the core is our character. And so if you want to really transform someone, if you want to speak words of life at a very deep level, you affirm their core. And you say something like, Brandon, this project has been unbelievable. You have been burning in at both ends in the middle, and you have shown unbelievable resilience. I cannot believe the way you have persevered day after day, week after week to get this done. And it's no less than amazing. And I just want to thank you. You've shown tremendous integrity in the way that you've dealt with the people who are affected by this. We knew that this was going to cause upheaval, and you showed integrity by going and being honest with people, by being direct, but then also just the resilience you showed. And I'm grateful for that, and I just commend you for it.
Wow.
So those are words of life that go deep into our core. All three types of affirmation are really important, and they're all needed. And the key is doing it often and early. Those are the two things.
Often and early.
Yeah.
So can you mix those three? Can I give feedback that's got style, conduct, and core?
Of course.
Okay.
And in some cases, they're often hard to separate. In other words, our conduct, our core. And so sometimes they just bleed together, and that's okay. But let me tell you this, they're powerful. And when you affirm someone's core, I'm surprised at how often it brings tears to people. There's a very deep emotional reaction. Yeah. I spoke at a place up in D.C. a few months ago, and I spoke in the afternoon, and then we had a pre-dinner reception before where we had the evening meal. A man came up to me and said, hey, I came to your session today, and I'm not a very affirming person, and I was tough on my son. And I called him. He lives in California now. We were in D.C. I called him, and I spoke words of life to him. And he said the effect was so profound. Here was a son that I was too hard on. I didn't encourage him enough. I didn't affirm him enough. And for the first time, maybe ever in his life, I spoke words of life at a really deep level. And this man just teared up right on the spot. It moved him. I think it moved his son, but it moved him.
So you're making a nice transition that I want to kind of end our time with today before we start to kind of wrap up and talk about family. Talk about how we can do this. I was having lunch with a colleague of mine, and it sounds, I think hearing your richness adds another color to my simple recommendation I gave him. But I said to him, he was talking about challenges he's having with his son. And I said, we often tell our children that we love them. But I find that it's not quite the same thing as telling them you also like them too. Mm-hmm. And when we tell them we like them, what I'm learning now from you is that's recognizing and affirming their style or their conduct or their core when you tell them that. And I think there's something that just makes them thrive when we do that. So I said this to him, and he said, well, what happens if you don't like them? And it was really kind of, it's humorous to say it now, but it was a sad sentiment.
Well, if that child was an adolescent, there are a lot of unlikable moments.
They were a teenager.
Yeah. What I think is even more powerful, I love you is a little overdone. I like you. Sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not. Is I value you. In other words, I place tremendous value on who you are as a person. And parents need to speak words of life to their children. Those words of life are ultimately what transform. It's good to affirm someone's style. It's good to affirm their conduct. But affirm their core whenever possible. because that, in fact, is what brings out the best. Every person who works with children, not be it a parent, a coach, a teacher, a religious leader, we're all wrestling with this. Isn't that what we want?
Yeah.
I see this athlete that has, gosh, they have such potential, but they're not fulfilling it. How do I bring out the best in that person?
Yeah.
That's what we should be focused on.
And I think you made a very quick comment early on, but I would want to kind of add some of my just anecdotal life experiences, that this impacts immune systems. We had a neighbor family from us, and it seems like they were always sick. The whole family was always sick, and there was no words of affirmation. There was no words of life. It was always other kinds of conversations they were having. Maybe not quite as far as words of death, but it was just an environment you could feel wasn't the words of life or affirmation. And they were always in and out of the hospital, in and out of illnesses. And I've seen that more and more often. This stuff really does affect our health.
No question. By the way, I don't think we have time today to go into this topic in depth, but one thing we should talk about is the question of, well, people do screw up. I mean, sometimes they don't perform well, or a kid needs discipline.
That's true.
I interviewed a bunch of CEOs for this book, and I asked them a question. I said, what boss contributed most to your being in the job you're in now as a CEO? And I heard this story over and over and over again. They said this, they would mention the name of a particular boss, and they said, he or she was really tough on me. They were hard. But I never doubted, even for a second, that they were really for me.
Yeah.
They gave me a lot of tough feedback, but they did it in a way that I knew they wanted me to excel, they wanted me to have their job, and so on.
When I've asked questions, when I would teach full-time MBAs, I would ask the same kind of question when you've gotten great feedback. You have folks that had been in the military, or maybe worked in hospitality or restaurants, which can be a tougher environment if you're in restaurants.
Brutal.
But they also the same thing, just like that. If I knew they had positive intention for me, it didn't really matter how they said it, if I knew where it was coming from.
Right.
All right, so we're getting close to the end here, and I always ask all of my guests this question. So what is one life hack you might have for us to help us live a life more free from dysfunction?
Several years ago, I was invited to speak to a group of leaders that had gathered in France. And about a month before we were leaving, and my wife Ann was going with me, she said, I've never told this, but I've had a lifelong dream to go to Portugal. And do you think we could just stop the weekend before the meeting starts and go to Portugal? And I was very busy at that time. I was distracted. I said, sure, that's fine. Just work it out with the travel agent. Well, she did. She got our tickets rescheduled to leave on a Thursday to go to Portugal. What I didn't know until about 5 days before was the hotel confirmation arrived, and I opened it, and I didn't think it was even possible, much less legal, to charge this much for a hotel. I mean, it was just egregious. It was outrageous. And I said, Ann, we can't do this. And she said, I knew you'd be upset, but it was the only hotel that was available. And so what I'm doing is we have the old blue suitcase up in the attic, and I've packed it full of food. And so we're going to save money on our meals. So by then it was too late to deal with it. So we went over, we flew all night, got up that first morning.
With a suitcase of food?
With a suitcase of dried food. I didn't even know about Parmalat milk, but you don't have to refrigerate Parmalat. You just open it. So anyway, we got up that first morning, and she handed me a box of bran flakes, and I had my Swiss Army knife, so I cut it open, poured this warm shelf milk that you don't even have to refrigerate, and she handed me a plastic spoon. That was breakfast. Well, it was pretty dreadful, to tell you. The view was magnificent, but the food was horrible. Well, she said, let's go ahead and tour Lisbon. So we got on the elevator. It stopped at the mezzanine. And I can see this picture so clearly. The doors of the elevator parted, and we're looking straight into the hotel dining room. It was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. It looked like a movie set. These long tables with white tablecloths, ice swans, just laden with some of the most amazing food. And there was this happy buzz in the room. And all I could think about was, I should be in there. And she read my mind, grabbed my arm, went down the stairs and toured. Well, lunchtime came. We bought a Coke from a street vendor, sat on a park bench. She handed me a pull-top ring of tuna fish. So I pulled that. That was so this went on for 3 days, man, and I'm not kidding.
Oh, you kept this up?
Well, yes. She'd brought all this food. And that was the way we were saving money. So anyway, finally, the night before we were leaving, I went to the hotel desk. We were leaving very early the next morning. And I just said, hey, I just want to clear my bill up. And as I turned to leave, the desk clerk said, Mr. Irwin, have you made your reservation for breakfast in the morning? And I said, what? And just in the next 10 seconds, it became clear that all of our meals.
Oh, no, Tim.
I hate to tell you that this is
they were all included.
All the meals, not, breakfast, lunch, and dinner were all included. That's why the hotel was so expensive.
Oh, no.
So And what I tell people sometimes, I mean, this was painful. And Ann said, well, someday you're going to get a good story out of this. But
the day's arrived.
hopefully today is it. Hopefully I've gotten over this. But, I tell leaders sometimes, look, you can be eating in the hotel dining room. I said, why are you eating in the room? Why are you eating dry bran flakes with warm shelf milk? In other words, you could be getting so much more. People don't go to work wanting to screw up. They go to work wanting to excel. I mean, I think it's baked into us. And so all you have to do is bring out the best in others, and you can eat in the dining room. It's your perfect right. People go to work expecting to do that. And so my life hack is, hey, we've got so many people around us who need to hear words of life. Maybe it's a child. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's a spouse. Or in my world, maybe it's somebody that works for you.
Yeah.
My life hack is speak words of life and stop using all those words of death.
Yeah, I love it. So I want to talk about where people can go to learn more about you and your book. Your book is Extraordinary Influence, and this has been an extraordinary interview. So I'm so thrilled to have had you on for this, and we'll definitely promote this because it's such a gift to people. If people want to learn more about you or even purchase a copy of the book, where can they go?
Well, the book is everywhere books are sold.
Okay.
I mean, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, 1-800.
All those standard places.
Yeah.
Great.
And you can go to my website, drtimirwin.com. Dr. Tim Irwin. Irwin spelled with an I.
DR for doctor, then Tim, T-I-M, and then Irwin, I-R-W-I-N.
That's it. .com.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely wonderful. And I could see there was even more we didn't cover that we could next time. So this was fantastic. And thank you for listening and watching the show. Catch a new show each Sunday at 7:30 p.m. And on iTunes, thebrandonsmithshow.com, and live on Facebook.com/Brandon Smith WPT for Workplace Therapist. Of course, you can check out my website, theworkplacetherapist.com, for past shows, blog posts, and other resources to help you live a life more free from dysfunction. And if you've enjoyed today's show, and we certainly hope you have, please, please, please rate and review us and subscribe on iTunes, because that allows other folks to find the show and learn about the mission that we're on. So until our next show and next time we get to connect, have a great week and an awesome life.